I think we should make a start. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Archive Centre. This is, of course, very much a bittersweet moment, I think, because on the one hand, I think I speak for the whole Archive Centre team when I say to Ayodele and Ayabonga that we're going to miss you. The last 5 weeks have gone incredibly quickly, and I think we've benefited enormously from having you in the Churchill Archive Centre and for everything that you've done for us. So thank you. But on the other hand, we're really looking forward to hearing this afternoon about your work at the University of Fort Hare in the National Heritage and Cultural Studies Centre with the Liberation Archive and your other collections. And for those of you who don't know the background to this and who don't know our speakers, and I think most of you probably do, Ayodele Ladokun is a technical archivist and projects coordinator at the University of Fort Hare, with many years of experience in lecturing in computer literacy and working with IT systems and digital capture. Ayabonga Meyi has a first degree in social work and a postgraduate diploma in archives and records management from the University of Fort Hare, and is just starting on a career in archives, which we're all going to watch with great interest. They're here as a result of a strategic collaboration between this college and the University of Fort Hare, which is itself part of a much longer relationship between Churchill College and South Africa, which you can trace right back to the South African bursary scheme in the 1970s. But this particular initiative has been 2 years in the making, and your visit here is very much the first step. And of course, we owe an enormous amount to Lord Boateng, the chair of the Sir Winston Churchill Archive Trust, who played a key role in initiating this link. So I think it's appropriate that as we look towards the next steps, as we look towards the future, we now hear from you about your archive. So Ayodele, Ayabonga, over to you.
Good afternoon, all. Good afternoon, all. Like Alan said, my name is Ayodele and this is Ayabonga. We are from the University of Fort Hare in South Africa. We are here today to present to you our center and what we do and how we can collaborate to push scholarship forward and also explore the interrelationship between the United Kingdom at large and South Africa. Ayabonga is going to start with a piece about the university itself. Sorry if the thing sounds a bit academic. My director is a historian, so whenever you're talking about something, in this case archives, you need to put some historical context to it. But I do hope you will enjoy it.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'll talk briefly about Fort Hare history. University of Fort Hare was established as a missionary teaching college in 1916 by a group of renowned African scholars. It is one of South Africa's and Africa's oldest university. By that time, African education had become insidious in parts of the Eastern Cape. 19th century mission schools had brokered a social identity of educated African elite entrenched in this area, earlier than anywhere in Southern Africa. Within Xhosa communities, various denominational institutions such as Blythewood, Clarksbury, Hilltown, Lovedale, Shawbury, St. John's, St. Matthews, and Gwali, to name a few, had sprung up. Being educated or not being educated within this historical process gradually assumed cultural and identity significance. That emergence of a new literate intelligentsia became one of the key components of early African nationalism and militancy in the Eastern Cape. At the beginning of the 20th century, self-conscious African elites began to challenge parameters of missionary education that had produced them. Nevertheless, ideological constructions and reconstructions within and outside the mission schools network became pervasive, and aspects of nationalism were also shaped by the prevailing political climate. Of significance, Union government, which became state without a nation, had embarked on a segregation route from its earliest formation. Forte then emerged at this critical period, in which, in the words of Sol Plaatje, the African was becoming a pariah in the land of his birth. Even within this framework, Forte grew immediately into a prominent educational institution during and after the two world wars. In the course of these years, its breeding role spanned many generations of leaders, and it became the critical preparatory ground for various intellectuals in the wider Africa continent and throughout South Asia. Yet, it is critical to re-emphasize the close links of this university with other neighboring historical institutions, particularly Lovedale, just across the Kume River. Here in this area, a radiant counter-curriculum from the 1930s had propelled a more radical content of African nationalism and was reflected in spate of protests and riots during the 1940s and continued to nationalism and was reflected in a spate of protests and riots during the 1940s and continued on the next decades. Cross-fertilization of political ideas between Lovedale and Forte students, as well as the members of the Kume River Valley community, has been noted over the years. Forte residents in particular had become seedbeds for most political ideas to grow. The list of those who either activated such discussion or those who benefited from such discourses is endless. Apartheid government's attack on integrated higher education from late 1950s onwards reduced Forte to a typical Bantustan institution. Despite its continued acceptance of students within and even beyond South African borders, its administration in ensuing years fell increasingly under the control of national party loyalists and was effectively planned to cater for the homeland system. The clampdown on student radicalism and death of knell of the last remnants of the mission schooling in the mid-1970s coincide with the emergence of spurious homeland state of Transkei and later Ciskei. Invariable, Forte graduates fed the institutional, bureaucratic, or even the operational networks of these homelands. Even so, its resilience in shaping revelation movements requires special mention. One should not lose sight of the other role Forte played in serving and as the center of political mobilization and resistance in apartheid regime during the insurrectional period. Crucially, that latter role has been highly recognized in the institution in the transitional phase to democracy. Whilst Forte still faced its turbulent transformation in the dying years of apartheid, the institution was chosen to serve as the custodian of many archives of the liberation movement. It enjoyed overwhelming popular support at a critical period when other major territory institutions were facing realignments and measures. In the early 2000s, the institution was also bestowed the Supreme Order of Bob and its historical role in liberation democracy. It nevertheless still faces greater challenges of redefining its historical legacy whilst identifying itself contemporary and future challenges. I'll now hand over to Ayodele to talk more about the National Heritage Center in the archives.
The University of Forte's National Heritage and Cultural Studies Center, NAHECS, which was formally opened in 1998, holds a diverse archives of various organizations and entities. That's our building. Within an academic environment, we are cognizant of the general roles of archives in scholarship production. There are a lot of definitions people give to archives, but for us at NAHECS, NAHECS takes a relatively modest definition of archives. We see archives as materials from the past, encompassing the very recent past, written, oral, pictorial, visual, or even audio form, often collected with the intention of enabling contemporary operations of respective entities. Such entities may be organizations that are either social or political, or even in different characters. They can also be academic institutions, or administrative or governmental divisions. Or they can either be non-governmental, business, or community formations. Essentially, the collection and the archiving of generated records or materials enable contemporaries or interested parties, and mainly historians, to retrieve senses of such entities' past or their lives to reflect upon their manifestation. The NAHECS collection. Before I go to the NAHECS collection, we've got two buildings. We've got the Heritage Center and where our repository is, an ultra-modern building with climate-controlled facilities. And then we've also got the DBS Gallery, where most of our museum activities occur. So, in an outline, diverse UFH, that's University of Fort Hare, diverse UFH archives, in spite of the unevenness in their recataloguing, remain in healthy shape for research and scholarly output. The NAHECS collection is divided into and managed in two divisions, which are namely museum and archives. The museum division is more aligned with the DBS Gallery, the DBS Art Gallery that was first used in 1989. It holds a variety of artifacts that consists of an assembly of heritage objects from parts of the Eastern Cape, especially from the Transkeian areas. These collections are equally fundamental for the heritage and cultural aligned scholarship. The majority of the artifacts from this museum division were collected from local groups of this region by the couple Estelle and Hamilton Welsh between the late 1800s and 1940. Those are some of the collections. Currently known as the Estelle and Hamilton Welsh collection, that was donated to Fort Hare. It became part of the Fort Hare Early Museum assemblage. The Estelle Hamilton Welsh materials were reinforced from the late 1930s by fresh ethnographic and further artifactual collections, which the newly established African studies during the 1930s and its subdiscipline anthropology named it the F.S. Malan collection. F.S. Malan was one of the Cape liberal politicians of the late 19th to early 20th century, who also had supported the foundation of Fort Hare in 1916 to be built adjacent to the historic Lovedale College, which was 50 years older, and also the owner of Lovedale Press, of which some of you may have heard about, on the Chiume River Valley. From the mid-1940s, both Estelle and Hamilton Welsh and F.S. Malan collections were then attached to anthropology as part of the exposition and curricula of the African Studies Department. Gradually, African Studies began to collect different artworks that mainly depicted African socio-political lives in a rapidly rural, changing, and consequently urbanizing South Africa. That became basis for the contemporary South African black art collection, which in recent times exceeds over 200 artworks of various shapes, mainly painting and sculptures. Most of these depict social history of Southern Africa, largely rural transformation, migrancy, and urbanization. They also portray the key struggle process of black South Africans and their interaction with other parts of the world. The painting and fine art endeavor was also buttressed by the advent of fine art department at the University of Fort Hare during the mid-1970s. Therefore, the assembling of all these artifacts, ethnographic and artwork at NAHECS constitute an important museum division for this center. Essentially, the museum division propelled the curatorship line function of NAHECS. Secondly, the NAHECS Archives Division that is aligned mainly with the repositories of the center is in turn divided into two subunits, the Heritage and the Liberation Movement Archives. The genesis of the Heritage Archives was within the facet of African languages, which too were initially part of African Studies when the department was created in the 1930s. Much of the material emerged with individual writers who coincidentally were renowned prior students and primarily produced the kept isiXhosa collection. Amongst a few prominent ones include A.C. Jordan, G.I.M. Zamani, P.T. Ntuze, L.T. Mayase, K.S. Bongela, and I.B. Mbele. As aforesaid, in the process of the growth of their collection, they were ephemerically kept within the Center of Xhosa Literature and would be eventually subsumed to NAHECS after 1997. Cogently, the Heritage Archives steadily included literary and audiovisual isiXhosa materials, other African languages such as Zulu, Southern Sotho, and English, as well as snippets of Afrikaans. Some of the miscellaneous materials include dissertations, theses, and in the isiXhosa language, poems, literature, and literature materials. There are also the old Radio Xhosa series, serial scripts that are in form of audio tapes and scripts. There are also incomplete sets of manuscripts from Henderson Soga, one of the earliest writers of African history, and especially Southern Nguni group. Some of these papers were salvaged during the 1970s, during the unfortunate phase of the diminishing Lovedale and its renowned press. They form part of the Heritage Archives. The old vernacular newspapers, most of which were also printed by Lovedale Press, form part of the set of collection. They also include Tengo Jabavu, Izimvo Zaban Sundu, and later newspapers such as Umklobo, Umsebenzi, and Umteteleli Wabantu that contains Nelson Mandela's speech during the infamous Rivonial trial. There are also later editions of newspapers such as Umhluyiwa and extracts of Transkei News. The Liberation Movement Archives was created from 1992 when the freshly unbanned political organization began depositing to the university most of the materials they generated during the exile and political struggle aeon since the early 1960s. This is our most recent attraction. These archives, especially the records of the operations of various political formations, have been key sources of reference for series of publications that are related to liberation histories in South Africa. Dates of origin for these political parties vary significantly, and they are all associated with 20th century, an era that followed conquest and is related to political and social exclusions, segregation, and later apartheid. The verbatim of the collections that are deposited to NAHECS largely relates to the period following the prohibition from 1960, when black liberation political parties had to reconstitute themselves from exile until their unbanning in 1990. It has to be underlined that there have been renewed commitments in recent years on African representation in a post-colonial and post-apartheid Africa, where political powers had changed to African hands. The most referenced series drawn from these NAHECS-held liberation movement archives on written South Africa's socio-political transition is that of the South African Democracy Education Trust, SADET History Project. In fact, from the early 2000s, the SADET project gathered many black South African scholars and researchers to produce several volumes around a theme, the road to democracy in South Africa. In that period, nearly 20 years working on that series, several scholars have utilized verbatim drawn from NAHECS Liberation Movement archives. The largest collection of the NAHECS Liberation Movement archive is that of the African National Congress, which originated in 1912. The African National Congress record at NAHECS cover various missions and covers various missions and the operation of this political organization, especially during its exile years. The archived material encompassed more than 30 countries globally, and the majority of these being within the African continent. From 1992, the bulk of the ANC records deposits came in physical shape of paper-oriented manuscripts interspersed by visual and audio materials. A memorandum of agreement was signed by both ANC and the university during the same year, outlining commitment of the two organizations in the upkeep of the records. The memorandum of understanding or agreement also clarified that the university's custodianship role over the archives. Physical cataloging conducted by two staff members of the Howard Pym Library took almost a decade from the late 1990s to the 2000s. The relocation of the material to NAHECS was shortly followed by the preparation of trial digitization, which the ANC self-funded and outsourced a private company to showcase limited digital archives for its centenary celebration in 2012. That's the ANC's centenary celebration. With its further funding, the ANC extended commission to that private company and expanded digitization to majority of its collection until 2018. Essentially, almost 80% of the ANC paper-oriented records, that is manuscripts, currently held at NAHECS are now digitized. And that transition to digital archives has recently prompted modification of the original Memorandum of Understanding to encompass such adaptation. The remainder of the Liberation Movement archives remains physical and largely in paper form. It includes records of what is the original non-European unity movement, NEUM, which originated in the early 1940s, like the ANC, had strong presence through students on the UFH campus, especially in the 1940s and the early 50s. Some of those students who included Jane Gould and Isaac Tabata studied at Forte up to the early 1930s, even before this NEUM was created. And in the later years, others like A.C. Jordan, Livingston Nkoti, and have respectively papers devoted to their writing and activities. In recent times, the NEUM, Non-European Unity Movement, has been renamed New Unity Movement of South Africa, NUMSA, which many people are familiar with now. And new privately donated papers have continued to be deposited with us. The NAHECS Liberation Movement archives also include records of the Pan-African Congress, PAC, that was crucially led by one of the UFH alumni of the 50s, Mongoliso Robert Sobukwe. The PAC led anti-pass campaign, which resulted to the Sharpeville massacre of 1960 and other killings in Langa, near Cape Town, during the same year. Sobukwe was like some of the ANC leaders incarcerated at the infamous Robben Island, after the PAC was like other political party, militant military wing. Other political parties, banned in 1960, barely a year after it was formed. Its radical faction that remodeled itself as militant military wing, operating under banner Ama Africa POC, or the Real Africans, was repressed ruthlessly by the apartheid state after 1963. The repression hit the PAC hard, and it struggled to remobilize itself in exile. Though members of its refashioned military wing, the Azania People's Liberation Army, ALPA, also underwent covert military training. From 1992, the PAC, like the ANC, also started depositing its own materials to us. The deposited PAC records are primarily donations of individual papers. Some cover the era of the organization and its mission in most African countries during their exile years. The NAHECS Liberation Movement Archive also have oddments of records from the Black Consciousness Movement, BCM, that also dominated politics during the 1970s, especially after aligning with the South African Students Association, SASO, from 1969 on our campus. Whilst the BCM, that's the Black Consciousness Movement, era was ephemeral, it was still strong at UFH and other campuses, especially in the North, Toflop, the University of Western Cape, UWC, Durban, and Westville. The BCM record at NAHECS are also buttressed by papers of the Azania People's Organization, AZAPO, which too was launched in the late 1970s following the banning of BCM. Similarly to the ANC, the PAC, BCM, AZAPO, NUMSA also concluded memorandums of agreement with our university in 1992 on the latter's custodianship of their respective records. In summary, then all the records of these political organizations are also properly catalogued. They constitute the remainder of the NAHECS Liberation Movement archives. As aforesaid, they are not yet digitized, as opposed to that of the ANC. Finally, within the collections of NAHECS Liberation Movement archives, there are several records that have been made as donations by individuals who played central role in cultural, sports, and politics. The team of NAHECS archivists have devoted their time over the years cataloging these materials as part of the sports and liberation material. Materials have been tagged under the names of respective contributing individuals. Some of these papers have been used in several writings that focused on the history of sports and unity in a segregated South Africa. Other materials contributed in smaller series that also articulated sports and liberation. Essentially, such materials resonate with not only one broad nature of political mobilization that majority South Africans affiliate to, but also the resilience of the country, social movement during the epoch from the 1970s and onwards. This is part of our facilities that looks familiar to the Churchill archives here. This is where we keep our records. And one of the vaults opened, you could see our aisle. And this is where we keep some of our cultural collections. That's the facility. And then we also have, talking about handling, data handling, document handling. We've got our ladders and our shelves and our moving trays and everything. So this is our session room. This is where we do our sessioning before moving it into the vault. It's a bit limited in space, but and these are our audio visual room. It's kept at almost freezing temperature too, so that the preservation of the audio cassettes and video VHS and Betamax could last longer. We also have reels, what you call reels, that we save. This is our office space. It's at the top floor of the building, and we've got a seminar room, actually named after Livingston Nkoti. Now this is our reading room, not so much like yours, but this is our reading room. This is where we host our researchers, and this is where we keep our artworks and sculptures, all our other heritage collections. You could see there, it's got this thing that moves because the artworks are hung on that side. And this is part of a collection from Somafco in Tanzania. They used to have a school, the ANC, while in exile in Tanzania, they used to have a school called Solomon Matangu Freedom College, where they were training the exilees to have skills. They were training them to have skills so that after the freedom fight, at least they will have the skills to run the country. So when the regime, the apartheid regime was finished, the school was closed down, and then they came home with all their materials there. And now they are always on display. We exhibit them. We also have some rare collection. This boot you see in the glass is the original boot Chris Hani wore in an operation called Operation Wake Operation. That's the original boot. It was donated to us by his family. And that guitar you see there was the guitar owned by, the original guitar owned by Govan Mbeki. That's the father of the former president Thabo Mbeki, who was in jail with Nelson Mandela in Robben Island. So they were in jail for a long time. And these are people who had families. So while he was in jail, he was a good guitarist. So he used to write songs for his wife, basically missing his wife. So he would write a song, sing the song. I'm not sure if there is the song anywhere, but we've got the original lyrics. It's one of those papers you see there, and that's the original guitar he used to play while at Robben Island. Okay, we've got other archives outside NAHECS that is linked to NAHECS. This, I'll just quickly run through them. These are important. These archives show some of the important facets of the university, and it consists of a wide range of records that emanated with the university's inception, since the university's inception in 1916. The bulk of such records fall under the domain of the registrar, the university registrar, and are held distinctly inside the Alice campus's administrative building. These proceedings have continued to grow to present times, mirroring the enduring operation and activities of the university. At the fulcrum of the UFH records that are generated in the last 109 years, are profiles of its alumni. These There were over 30,000 files of individual students accounted just over 15 years ago in a research of last major monograph written mainly on the university's students' protests. The current number of these have expanded to about 50,000, especially within the context of a changing social geography and the evolving multi-campus character of the university. We have 3 campuses, and I mean, I don't know how you measure it in miles. Each campus is average over 120 kilometers apart from each other. So, in different cities. So, especially within the context of changing geography, they illustrate in great deal that in the first 4 decades of the university's existence, it became the main institution in Southern, Central, and Eastern Africa to offer higher education for Africans. In spite of the emergence of universities like Makerere in Uganda during the early 1920s, Forte continued to up to the early 50s to attract students from colonial Rhodesia, later Zimbabwe and Zambia, Nyasaland, later known as Malawi, Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, now known as Tanzania, and other countries around Southwest Africa, now known as Namibia, Bechuanaland, now known as Botswana, Basutoland, now known as Lesotho, and Swaziland, as well as from crucially, those old students' records captured brief profile of students, which formed basis for production of individual biographies and individual life histories. These records have also been used in several monographs that illustrate a great deal how the university contributed to the seeds of modern African nationalism, with some alumni being at the forefront of leadership and politics in their respective countries. The list of those in UFH alumni who became senior leaders of respective countries is endless. For instance, in highlighting a few, Elim Pumla Ngozwana, who was born in Clarkberry Mission Station in South Africa's Eastern Cape, completed a BA degree in 1933. Thereafter, devoted some years in promoting education for girls and women. She married a Ugandan, Christopher Kisosonkele, then later became the first black woman in the Ugandan Legislative Council, a South African. Eventually, she represented Ugandan women at international level. Other individuals include Eliud Wambu Matu from Kenya, who, after completing his BA degree in 1934, will be the first African to sit on the Kenyan Legislative Council from 1944. There is also Yusuf Lule from Uganda, who after graduating in 1999 became the principal of Makerere University, and he would later become the president of Uganda. We've got Seretse Khama of Botswana, who graduated in 1944 and then came to Oxford University to study. And then also he was later going to be elected the first president of independent Botswana. Those were some of our alumni. Then we've got Robert Mugabe, who schooled in our university in the 1950s, held Alice as a place where his political awareness was shaped, and since went on to become the president of Zimbabwe. Now, talking about South Africans, notable South Africans, we know Nelson Mandela, who also was in the forefront of the liberation struggle and also went on to become the president of South Africa. We have Oliver Tambo. We have Oliver Tambo, who now is the one that our international airport is named after. We've got Robert Sobukwe, the founder of the PAC. We've got Kaiser Matanzima, albeit controversial. They played controversial role, and Mangosuthu Buthelezi. We also have Chris Hani, who was a later stalwart, who also was the leader of the South African Communist Party, SACP, and the chief of staff of Umkhonto Wesizwe, that is the military wing of the ANC during the armed struggle. We have Professor Z.K. Matthews, who was the first graduate of the university and also later came to lecture at the university and also became an acting principal or what you call the rector at the university, and is the grandfather of the current minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Minister Naledi Pandor, Dr. Naledi Pandor. We also have people like Govan Mbeki, who is the father, or who was the father of the former President Thabo Mbeki, of South Africa's President Thabo Mbeki, and so on. There are so many that are. We've got also people who are prominent in sports. Dr. Ivan Kosa, who is the founder of Orlando Pirates Football Club in South Africa, a big football club, one of the biggest football clubs in South Africa. And we also have people in the entertainment industry, like Ernest Mangoba, like Kantemba. We've got, we could go on and on. So all these, they are records we have. They are original handwritings, everything you need to know about them, although the Protection Act now limits access to some of this. You need permission from the family or something before you can get it, but we have those records. And you cannot talk about our university, you cannot talk about the struggle history of South Africa and the liberation history without mentioning our university. So I would also like to talk about some projects that we are currently doing. Some we've completed, some is ongoing, some are imminent. I'm not going to talk much, sorry, I'm skipping that part. I'm not going to talk much about them. I'll just mention them, then I can answer questions afterwards. We've got projects like, there was the University of Fortes Preservation Project, where you see some of these records I was mentioning earlier on the University Registrar side could be said to be over 100 years old. And these are paper. And then you can imagine what's been happening to those papers. So there was a concern that there was a need for preservation to take place, especially so as to limit human interaction with the paper, not to further make it degrade faster. So we got funding from the Department of Science and Technology. Now they are called Department of Science and Innovation, to do the digitization. In fact, that was my first major project that I coordinated. We did it to a point, but COVID kind of halted the project. So, but it was one of the things we tried to do. Then my director is a professor of history, Oxford trained, and okay, and he has used these records to write a book on the 100 years, a pictorial book on the 100 years history of the university. That is one of the projects that we embarked on. Then currently, some of the buildings in our university has been nominated as one of the World Heritage Sites. So even we are still having series of meetings. There are some criteria we need to meet. We are getting inspections from United Nations, UNESCO, and so the process is really at almost its tail end now, and it's most likely we are going to get the nomination. We also have memorialization of some chieftaincies. For example, Chief Churchill gave Lovedale College land, and then Lovedale College gave us part of their land to form the university. And many people from Lovedale were part of the people who pioneered our university. Now, Chief Churchill was also kind of a victim of conquest. And in now modern day, there are initiatives from government to memorialize some of them. He's not the only one. There's Makoma, who is his brother. So we have been tasked to, in fact, this year, the funding was approved in February, and we have been tasked to deal with the prince, that's the grandson of Chief Churchill, who donated the land to Fort Hare indirectly, to memorialize him. So we are in liaison with him on how to memorialize him. There are many ways to memorialize. So you could build a memorial wall, but they want a totem. Their totem is a lion. So we are still working out the logistics, but that is one of the projects we do. Then also, National Liberation Heritage Institute of South Africa, NALISA, is headed by former Speaker of the House, Mam Baleka Mbete. This is a political party neutral organization of all the political parties I mentioned earlier that participated in the struggle. They are now coming together, going around the country to inspect their archives. So because we are one of the custodians of a majority of their archives, they have taken special interest in us, especially the preservation and a bit of conservation, although we are still working towards the logistics too. Also, we also have imminent partnership with Howard University on which involved the American Voices Against Apartheid. So there were people in America who were voicing against apartheid at that time. So they also had their own collection. There is a collection for that. So Professor Jean Bailey wants us to collaborate to link their archives with ours. So then we also have a collaboration with Harvard University and the University of Cape Town. They are working together they are working on on us becoming the custodian of the oral archives of banished people of South Africa. They are currently being compiled by historians in UCT, but once it finishes, we will receive the archive. So it will be part of our collection again. Then we've got scholarly research. We also have a research component, scholarly research component, because remember, we are also a heritage center, as we are an archive center. So we also do scholarly research on social histories, like even researching on a social history of a particular plant. Prickly pear, everybody knows prickly pear, but it's got a social history in South Africa. We were talking about it sometime. They used to use it to make some hard alcohol, and they do it locally, but the brewery board wants to fight it, that it should be regulated. But these ones are the locals are saying, no, it's part of our culture. You can't stop us from there. So we've got things like that. We do research on that. Do research on land relocation, forced removal and things like that. Because we've got the academic. Then we do a little bit of teaching too. Because they have been trying to integrate the content of our archives into the curriculum, into the history curriculum in our university. It's still ongoing, but we're getting there. We also have other activities like attending to researchers, what you do here. It goes on a constant basis. We receive visiting researchers from every corner in the world. Some we attend to them digitally, some we attend to them, they actually come down. So we also have such activities. Then we also provide avenue for the library and information department, academic department, to send their students over to us for internship for 2 weeks. So we are also busy with that. We are quite short-staffed, but all of us do all that too. So I'm going to round up very soon. So we have internship, then we are currently also doing transfer of skills, because despite the fact that we are short-staffed, it's even worse. A few of us are nearing retirement. Of the few staffs, some of them are nearing retirement now. Our artwork collection and other collections, we are still inventorying it. I told you we have over 200 plus black artworks. That is just one collection. There are several other physical collections. So some of them, because we've been loaning out that black art, it's already inventorized, it's cataloged, everything is okay, because the people interact with it more frequently. In fact, it got stuck during COVID at one place for a long time, so we probably will need to hold on to it for a while before it goes out again. But we've got other collections that we are still inventorying. So those are some of the activities we do every time. Now let's get to Churchill. Churchill is also one of the collaborations and activities that we are doing. It's a very recent one, the impending collaboration with Churchill Archive Center. The Churchill Archive Center, as we know, is the holder of Sir Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher's archives, as well as other individual collections. So these collections at that center, that this center holds, encompasses personal papers, individuals who made and remade Britain's domestic politics and international relations. So we intend to explore more of that international relations, especially with Margaret Thatcher's collection and Sir Winston Churchill's collection. Now, to talk about, okay, we've got our challenges, which I've listed here, but sorry. So the Churchill Archive Center. One of the budding collaboration efforts, which was earlier stated in my presentation, is the one we are currently nursing with the Churchill Archive Center. Here at the center, we have met wonderful people who inducted us into their efficient operational activities that ensures safety and proper long-term preservation of the materials they possess. They also provided access to archives without they also provide archives without compromising, access to archives without compromising its safety and preservation. Alan Parkwood, the director of the center, and Amanda Jones, the administrator, who facilitated our potential collaboration and smooth stay here in Cambridge. They even took their time to show us around Cambridge and Cambridgeshire. They also facilitated us going to different archives within and outside Cambridge to expand our knowledge on the archives and practices. We went to University of Cambridge Library, African Studies Center, where we met Janie, Cambridgeshire Council Archives in Ely, and also meeting Lord Boateng, who is actually my hero. I've read a lot about him before. Then meeting him, I had goosebumps at the House of Lords. Catherine Thompson took us through the back end and the front end of the online cataloging system, the archive search. Hannah James took us through the database and how activities from accessioning to production are recorded, stored for report writing and auditing purpose. Madeline Evans showed us some of the projects that are ongoing, showed us around the reading room how to deal with researchers, who have come to use the resources, use database to store their request, getting the order, processing it for the researchers. Sarah Leary and David Parker took us through the conservation side of archiving, where they taught us the ethics of handling documents and document restoration. These involved techniques of cleaning and fixing damaged documents, straightening pictures, making boxes, and stands for fragile materials. Andrew Riley showed us how to retrieve ordered documents from the repository and reading room for researchers. Chris Knowles took us through the digitization aspect of archives preservation, showing us the equipment and the digital asset management system they use, which is Libnova, that they use and how they ingest digital materials. Then we have Nicole Allen, Sophie Rages, Grace Warholt Campbell, Cherise Watson, and Paula Leiko, who also contributed in everything that has to do with service rendered here. Thank you very much for the memories you've given me and the skills. So now what's the way forward? That's us doing some of the things. So my interaction with Churchill Archives has shown me that there is no history that is isolated in the world. This is why we have been having discussions with other centers with rich histories. Strangely, there are a lot of interconnected documents of events between the center in the US and here now in the UK that NAHECS is having collaborative discussions with, as I mentioned earlier. The one happening here is the latest collaborative effort that we intend to have further allow researchers to become, from both sides, to have access to expand research and scholarship. This is the end of my presentation.